Have you ever wondered why, despite our flying machines and pocket-sized supercomputers, the one thing that truly binds us to a person living 5,000 years ago is a shared sense of dread toward a due date? It is the great invisible engine of civilization, a concept so old it predates minted coins and even, arguably, the wheel. We are talking about tax, a word that usually inspires a heavy sigh, yet it is the very glue that transformed wandering tribes into the builders of the pyramids. In the beginning, there were no forms to fill out or confusing deductions to claim. There was simply the Nile, a vast amount of grain, and a pharaoh who quite reasonably pointed out that if he was going to keep the universe from collapsing into chaos, he was going to need a cut of your harvest. In ancient Egypt around 3000 BCE, the first tax collectors weren't checking your bank statements. They were checking your backyard. Since money hadn't been invented yet, the state operated on a commodity basis. This meant that if you were a farmer, you paid in grain. If you were a craftsman, perhaps you surrendered a portion of your pottery. The pharaoh's viziers would conduct the Shemsu Hor, or the following of Horus, a biennial census where the king himself would travel the land to personally count the cattle. It was a royal road trip with a very high cover charge. The cleverness of the Egyptians lay in the Nilometer, a series of stone pillars that measured the river's flood levels. If the water was high, the soil would be fertile, and the taxman's smile would be broad. If the water was low, the state, usually, lowered its demands, showing a level of data-driven empathy that would make a modern auditor weep. This system wasn't just about greed. It was the birth of the social contract. The grain collected was stored in massive granaries, serving as a primitive insurance policy against famine. If the Nile failed to rise, the pharaoh would open the vaults, proving that while taxes were a burden, they were also the price of not starving. It was a sophisticated, if heavy-handed, dance of survival that set the stage for every empire to follow. As the sun set on the grain-filled storehouses of the Nile, the baton of bureaucracy passed to the Mediterranean's most ambitious bookkeepers, the Romans. If the Egyptians invented the tax, the Romans turned it into a high-stakes art form, complete with a sprawling legal code and a rather colourful cast of characters known as the publicans. These were not the friendly neighbourhood tavern owners the name might suggest today. They were private tax farmers who bid for the right to collect revenue in the provinces. The deal was simple. The state got a fixed sum up front, and the publican got to keep whatever extra he could squeeze out of the local populace. It was a system that functioned with the ruthless efficiency of a shark, though it predictably made the taxman the most uninvited guest at any dinner party in the ancient world. The Romans were nothing if not creative when it came to finding things to tariff. Beyond the standard land and poll taxes, they recognized that an empire of marble and legionnaires required a constant stream of silver. They taxed the manumission of slaves, the sale of goods in the marketplace, and even the basic ingredients of life. We owe the phrase "money doesn't smell" to Emperor Vespasian, who famously defended his tax on public urinals, a vital source of ammonia for the tanning and laundry industries, by holding a gold coin under his son's nose to prove that its origin didn't diminish its value. But Roman taxation was also the engine of integration. To pay your taxes, you had to use Roman currency. To use the currency, you had to participate in the Roman economy. This salt of history funded the very roads that allowed the legions to move and the trade to flow, creating a feedback loop of prosperity and extraction. However, as the empire grew bloated and the borders became harder to defend, the tax burden shifted from a manageable fee for civilization into a crushing weight that drove many small farmers to give up their freedom just to escape the debt. It turns out that while you can build a world on revenue, you can also accidentally bury it if you don't know when to stop digging. With the collapse of Roman central authority, the taxman didn't disappear. He simply traded his toga for a suit of armor. In the Middle Ages, the tax system became deeply personal, woven into the very fabric of the feudal pyramid. This was the era of feudal dues, where instead of sending a check to a faceless treasury, you owed your labor, your crops or your life to the local lord in exchange for a spot of land, and the vague promise that the neighboring baron wouldn't burn your barn down. It was a localized, messy, and highly manual way of keeping the lights on. But as monarchs began to dream of grander things, namely expensive crusades and dynastic wars, the old system of showing up with a shield no longer sufficed. The kings needed cold, hard cash. Enter King John of England, a man whose talent for losing territory was matched only by his genius for inventing new ways to charge people for it. John famously exploited scutage, a fee paid by knights to get out of military service. He increased these levies so frequently and so arbitrarily that the English barons eventually decided they had reached their limit. In 1215, on the marshy fields of Runnymede, they forced John to sign the Magna Carta. While we often celebrate this document as a beacon of human rights, it was at its heart a very high-stakes dispute over a tax bill. It established the revolutionary principle that the king couldn't just dip into his subjects' pockets whenever he felt a bout of ambition. He had to ask for consent. This spark changed the trajectory of Western governance. It gave birth to the idea of a parliament, a place where the people, or at least the wealthy ones, could haggle with the crown. The taxman was no longer just a predator. He was now a negotiator. This shift transformed the grumpy peasant into a stakeholder, even if a reluctant one, and ensured that if a king wanted to go to war, he first had to convince the taxpayers that it was a venture worth their coin. It was the moment the world realized that while the power to tax is the power to build, it is also the power that requires a leash. The transition from medieval bartering to the modern era was fueled by the steam of the Industrial Revolution and the salty spray of the Atlantic. By the 18th century, the taxman had discovered the intoxicating potential of sin taxes and luxury duties. Nothing was safe. Windows, hats, and even playing cards carried a price tag for the privilege of ownership. However, it was a particularly famous levy on dried leaves that changed everything. When the British Crown decided to tax tea in the American colonies without giving the locals a seat at the decision-making table, they weren't just asking for a few extra pennies, they were inadvertently lighting the fuse of the American Revolution. The resulting Tea Party in Boston Harbor proved that while people might tolerate a tax, they absolutely loathe an invisible taxman who doesn't listen to their grievances. As nations grew into global powers, the cost of maintaining massive navies and fighting world wars outpaced what could be squeezed from tea and window panes. This led to the birth of the modern income tax, a temporary measure introduced in many countries during the 19th and early 20th centuries to fund military efforts. In the United States, the 16th Amendment made this arrangement permanent in 1913, forever shifting the burden of civilization from what you buy to what you earn. Today's tax brackets and digital filings are a far cry from counting grain in the Nile, yet the spirit remains the same. We have moved from the following of Horus to the algorithmic audits of the 21st century. While the methods have evolved from grain silos to cloud servers, the central mystery remains. How do we fund a society that provides roads, schools, and safety while keeping the system fair?